As we begin week 8, we're going to start learning about some of the branches or subfields of psychology. In this lecture, we're going to learn about the history of applied psychology, which began with mental testing. We'll cover some of the major contributors, including Alfred Binet, Louis Terman, Hugo Munsterberg, and Lillian Gilbreth. We'll finish with the Hawthorne studies. Let's begin with a brief overview of how applied psychology developed. Although it may not seem like it, applied psychology and mental testing are related. They are both focused on applying psychological principles to the study of individual differences. In fact, applied psychology got its start with mental testing in the late 1890s. Here is a timeline of some of the milestones in the history of applied psychology. In the 1880s, Francis Galton and James Cattell were both measuring individual differences with their studies of sensation and perception. They weren't using tests per se, they were simply measuring individual differences. Then in 1890, James Cattell published the first mental test. During World War I, Scott and Bingham helped develop group intelligence tests. In the 1830s, the Hawthorne studies were published, birthing organizational psychology and changing the way employees would be managed forever. Then, during World War II, more tests were developed, helping the military branches place recruits in jobs that were best suited to their talents. And in 1945, industrial organizational psychology became part of the APA. In the 1950s, tests became extremely popular in a variety of different settings. In the 1960s, the field contributed to the civil rights movement, and in 1982, SIOP, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists, was founded. The PSYOP organization is similar to the APA in that it provides both professional and research-related services to its members. Here is a summary of some of the most important contributors to mental testing and applied psychology. We will talk about many of these people in this lecture. Applied psychology didn't appear out of thin air. There were a series of events and a culture at the time that supported its establishment. There are reasons behind its emergence. In order to understand history, remember, we have to go back and look at some of the things that were going on at the time of an event. There are at least 3 reasons that applied psychology became popular in the early 1900s. Reason number 1, American pragmatism. The years between the 1890s and the 1920s are referred to as the progressive era. During this time, Americans were pragmatic. They wanted tools, supplies, services that were practical, that were useful to them, that made their lives easier. Remember, in a previous lecture, we learned about some of the inventions of the late 1800s. Coming off of those inventions, coming off of winning several wars, we were in a pragmatic mood. It was a time of technological advancement and improvement. People expected psychology to follow in these same footsteps and contribute to their lives, not just be a set of theories or ideas about human behavior, but actually help people in some way. Reason number 2, institutional reform. In the 1910s, Americans were concerned with reform. They were reforming government, business, education. They were making lots of changes as a result of the new inventions, the new ideas, the new practical services that were being created as a result of their demand for practical things. Because the country was going through these changes, the field of psychology also went through a transformation. The third reason has to do with universities and colleges. As psychology became more experimental, more and more labs were created, but the expense of these labs and the research went up. In order to justify the costs associated with these new experimental psychology labs, administrators wanted proof that the research they were investing in had some value. In order to provide this evidence, psychology had to pivot a little bit. Not only was it trying to be more scientific, more experimental, more objective, now it also needed to have this applied aspect. During this time, some psychologists chose to focus on the application of their research. Some did not. Those who did were professors and consultants in education, business, military, medicine, and legal settings. Initially, much of the consulting work involved mental testing, assessing individuals for some quality, some attribute.